And I'm particularly excited to talk to you because you have a very unique perspective that most people don't have. What's really cool is, so Paul's on the board of IOM, so Investa, and also then is an executive in residence at Rlabs, a venture builder, and then has a portfolio career of other startups and scale-ups, and particularly in ESG, because that's something close to my heart. The perspective of being on both sides and having run at Oxford a large part of the real estate business, and then the board side, and then the venture builder side. I really want to dig into that because no one has that perspective. Like, that's a cool one. And so I guess if you might maybe tell us a little bit about what you're doing these days and what you're excited about and how you find yourself sitting here at the bottom of the world being filmed with me.
Great, thanks, Joe. Great to be here. So yeah, it's been a really interesting transition for me after 25 years at Oxford in what I'll call a very traditional real estate role, series of roles. And it was innovative in as much as I was a pioneer going to a new market and trying to figure those aspects out. But it was, as we call, and I'm learning now in innovation speak, it was a Horizon 1 business, without a doubt. And so when made the decision to transition out of that role, and very flattered to be asked to stay around in a senior advisor capacity to my former team in the European region, and then the new team here, which includes a handful of board seats on the various platforms that we're doing. But what I really wanted to do was do a couple of things that were new and different that I really hadn't had I had a chance to do some from within that role, and there were other things that I had always wanted to do that I just didn't have time for. One of those was venture startup innovation stuff, which I'd seen a little bit about from my Oxford chair. The second was the ESG piece, which I really truly believe is critical and fundamental, and tried to figure out how to do that. The fund has recognized that there was a real need for innovation a long time ago, and then it wasn't going to be able to be done as effectively within the firm. And so actually set up the OMERS Ventures team. And one of the first OMERS Ventures teams was in a real estate venture builder called Rlabs. And I needed something to do when I was in Toronto that was different than Horizon 1 Oxford. It's great to still be in the family. So that was one part of it. And I'm doing some stuff at the university as well in Toronto, which has an interesting link into all of this kind of stuff. And then I think on the other extreme, on the ESG front, there's a friend of mine in London who I believe has the only real true net zero business, which is doing a lot of the same kind of things that Investa and Oxford has done. So it's a bricks and mortars business as opposed to a tech venture startup business. I'm so happy to talk about that because there's some really cool stuff in there. So I've got this portfolio life that's got a little Europe, a little Asia, got a little venture, got a little ESG, and I'm staying out of trouble.
That's amazing. How did you orchestrate that? Because I know a lot of people aspire to have a portfolio career at some time. And how do you still have some very senior roles that make a massive difference and you get to have multiple hats? Did you always intend to do that?
I had always intended to go back and teach. So that was an absolute priority. And my parents were teachers. I didn't want to be a teacher. I wanted to be a business guy, but it was always something that was in my DNA, and had the opportunity to use my leadership roles over the years to do some teaching, I guess, in an informal way through a leadership capacity, but also in a more formal way through various partnerships that we had with different educational institutions in the different geographies. And my heart was always with my alma mater, University of Toronto. So when I made the decision to go back to Canada, I said, I need something as a platform. I didn't want it to be the Oxford Canadian operating business, which I'd been so privileged to lead for many years before I went to London. And I didn't want to go all the way back to that. I had the opportunity to be in that kind of capacity in an advisory role with the business that I led more recently in Europe and Asia, so I needed to fill in some gaps. And so that was number one. And then a very close friend of mine who is now, I guess, a second-time entrepreneur, and this is actually kind of a fun story, he was the first real kind of data guy in the Canadian real estate industry. And I remember that he used to have these leather-bound books on comparable investment sales transactions.
Beautiful.
And like the encyclopedia
Yeah.
sales guy, right?
Yeah.
And he would take these books and he would sell them to appraisers or owners or banks, lenders. And it was the only real kind of consistent source of information that you could then, let's say, rekey into, back then, Lotus 123
Yeah, Lotus
spreadsheet.
123, exactly right.
And do the kind of analysis that you could do. And I remember vividly George saying to me, this is George Karras, the founder of Rlabs, saying to me, and Paul, there's this thing called the internet, and it's going to change the way we do things. And what George ended up doing was effectively create the first technology-enabled data that the entire industry bought into. So let's think of it, and I'm not allowed to actually say it this way, but think of it as the CoStar of Canada.
Yes.
And then George sold that business, and he went away and came back and said, what am I going to do next? And that's where he conceived of the need for innovation in real estate. So we can talk about the lab in a second.
Yeah.
But for me, when I went back to Toronto, and he and I were very good friends, and we actually had breakfast the first day of last autumn, so a year ago next Tuesday, at this little greasy spoon that we used to always get together for breakfast. And he said, what are you going to do? And I said, I'm going to do a little teaching, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. I said, but I need a platform, and I don't want to retire. I don't want to go start my own business, but I want to do something that's different. And he said, perfect. You're going to come to the lab.
That's right. For an entrepreneur, I hear, oh, I don't know what I'm doing. And I hear, you're coming with us.
And that's what he did, right? And
Exactly.
I think the reality is that let's not pretend that I'm an entrepreneur at 60 years old and after a 30-plus year career. I've been entrepreneurial, but I wasn't going to go start my own business. But I think one of the things that's been quite attractive to me about this is it's given me a chance to actually join an entrepreneurial business where I can bring some of my institutional and corporate experience to help them move to the next stage. And so it's really been a win-win, and so that's how it happened. So that's the portfolio. I had the university piece, I needed that piece, I wanted to solve for Toronto, I wanted to solve for London, and I wanted to still be able to come here. And so I have an awful lot more perhaps going on than I thought I would.
That sounds like a lot.
It's fun. Keeps me on my toes.
Yeah, and it sounds like you've created something that has synergies too between them. So the learnings, I know for myself, like the learnings, I'm assuming at Rlabs and the way that spills over, the way you're thinking, and then of course on the Investa board, being the innovation sponsor there, and with what I'm doing and we're doing, all of it blends together.
Yeah, and I did the Venn diagram in my head, and whether I will say that it probably blends together more than I ever thought it would, which makes it kind of fun.
That's really cool. Let's talk about Rlabs. So let's talk about what it is, why it's cool, and what's it like moving from running this big end of town business, corporate enterprise, governance, risk matrices, the world that we live in a corporate, and now you're in Rlabs with George, building businesses. Like, how is that for you?
Different. It's different, but again, that's what I wanted. It's really interesting, right? Because, and I'm learning what the difference between a venture capital investor versus a incubator or an accelerator versus a studio. I don't really think they have to be as rigidly defined as people like to, but it helps to differentiate one from the other. And what the lab is, which is I think probably why my skill set is hopefully the most compatible and helpful to that, is it actually is all of those things, okay? So it starts with the problem as opposed to the solution. So how are we going to solve housing? How are we going to solve climate change? How are we going to solve X, Y, Z? As opposed to, I've got this really cool tech solution, look how it does this, which often is what some entrepreneurs come forward with. And of course it's problem-based, but it's a solution. And so the lab starts with what's the problem? And it has capital through the various owners of the lab, one of which is OMERS, private equity ventures. So that's a nice connection. So it has capital. It has a team of people. So it has a analyst kind of research team. It has a marketing and comms team. It has a legal team. It has a finance team. And so if you are trying to solve a problem in real estate and you want to find a place that can support you in doing that so that you can really focus on the idea and the opportunity. And then basically what the statistics apparently prove out that this form of investment actually has a much higher probability of success than what some of these venture results are, which tend to be, let's call it in the 10% or less range, where these tend to be more in the 50% range. Because so it's almost like a corporate-ish approach to innovation. And so when I showed up, it was like, okay, I get this, but what I found when I got there is, let's not kid ourselves, it's not corporate at all. and George wanted to call me, I understand the term in innovation speak is EIR, stands for Entrepreneur in Residence. I said, let's not kid ourselves. That's not me. But at the university, they actually have executive in residence titles. And I said, can we use that one? Because I actually think my skill set will be better suited, not necessarily running one individual venture, but going across all the ventures, going up to the stakeholders, being able to link some of my relationships to bring that to bear on this. And then just the strategy, structure, people piece, right? To be able to help a small business think about things in a slightly more structured way. And so I show up like this in French cuffs and wingtips and a blue suit, and as opposed to white soled shoes and a hoodie. And you know what? It's been a ton of fun for the first part of this year.
I love that. It's one of the things I really find in my role. So with our early adopter program with startups, right, early stage startups, a big part of what my job is to basically educate them about what being enterprise ready actually looks like, and putting that structure. And they spend a lot of entrepreneurs have to spend a lot of time kind of building that shell of the business, like you say, the marketing, the legal, the MSAs, all of these things. It costs time, it uses up your runway,
uses up your capital. If you've done a seed round, you can burn through that kind of stuff very quickly if you're outsourcing it all.
Exactly. And what I'm seeing is entrepreneurs that haven't been in corporate, and a lot of the prop tech entrepreneurs are more senior people coming out of industry, like in their late 30s and 40s. So there tends to be a more sophistication of the prop tech entrepreneurs. But if you haven't actually sat on our side at all, and I remember this from my first startup, I hadn't sat on this side, you don't know what risk is going to, or what procurement, or what this is going to look like, or what the cyber questions are going to be. And so they're not ready. And then the pilots can't jump across the chasm and then actually go through the org because the startups aren't ready. So I think the idea of the venture builder is amazing because you actually provide like the exoskeleton to start to get them ready.
Yeah, and listen, I think there's a room for everything. So it's not that the lab and the venture builder is the only solution. I actually think that there's a whole bunch of different things that can be done. On your point about the type of entrepreneur, what I think the venture builder, and certainly my experience at the lab so far has been, is it broadens the type of entrepreneur that might potentially be interested in doing this. So we call them category 1, 2, 3, 4. Make sure I get this right. Category 1 entrepreneur, or category 1, let's call it that. Category 1 entrepreneur is a subject matter expert who, so me, who may never actually have been an entrepreneur.
Okay,
A category 4 at the other side is somebody who has been a repeat entrepreneur, but may not necessarily have real estate subject matter expertise. And then 2 and 3 are various combinations of the two. And so it allows, since we're starting with the idea and the infrastructure and the capital, it allows somebody to come in who perhaps is one of those four categories, or maybe we combine a subject matter expert with a repeat entrepreneur, and those people can end up being the founders or the co-founders of these ventures. Now, that won't work necessarily for the same person who wants to be the entrepreneur and be the next unicorn and all that kind of stuff. Or maybe it will, right?
Yeah.
So it's, it's early days, but I think it broadens the probability of success on what is a very multidimensional kind of risk matrix, if you will. And we can talk a little bit about some of the ventures. I think it's pretty interesting.
I like that. So I like the idea of, so do you see that less technical, maybe more diverse founders, do you see more of them coming through then versus if you had to build it completely by yourself externally?
Yeah, so there's a water venture. So we're looking at urban flooding as a problem that's resulting from climate change. And it's a very technical area, but not very technical, as well as software solution technical. And the person who is starting down the road as a potential co-founder of this is actually a practicing geotechnical engineer or whatever the specific discipline within at one of the world's largest global engineering services firms, who's saying, you know what, and this firm is actually coming in as a investor partner in the lab. So we get the corporate capability of that specific expertise, and then we get one of their people, and might actually end up with that person transitioning from having had the professional engineering role in the firm to being the founder of the lab, with the lab, or with founder of the venture in the lab, with the firm having an ownership position in the lab and in the venture, so it ends up being a win-win-win.
It's a great way of safely spinning out some of this stuff too. So from the board perspective, because until you're on a board, it's hard to understand, and I only know this because I did a short stint on a board, and I could now all of a sudden see how hard it was to have that view, but not actually being able to do anything. And not that you can't do anything, I didn't mean that. I just meant that you're not operating the business in the same way anymore. And so I have a question about, in terms of innovation and tech and kind of risk and looking forward, and not specifically about any of your particular boards, but are you seeing themes that the boards are thinking about or areas that they're putting their attention on?
So let me answer,
let
me comment on the board piece. I think you do have a perspective, and I'm new at this, and I was on a number of boards while I was in my executive role, and now I'm not in my executive role anymore. And so I've almost been freed to a certain extent from some of the challenges and the priorities, and so you can take a slightly higher perspective, but I'm far from very long out of those roles, still current. So I think that's just a commentary of the type of people, and certainly our board here with Investa has a similar sort of construct, type of people that we're fortunate to have together. So there's that piece. I think I will say there's a consistent theme across all the various platform boards that I'm on and the various things that I'm involved in. And that is that we've just come through an extraordinary global health crisis that has really accelerated so many different things, challenged so many different things. And so there is a high level of concern at every board table about what are we going to do differently, or what do we have to do differently going forward, because the world has changed. Some of the things are the same, but a lot of things are different, and the threats feel like they are coming at you from every direction on everything. You and I have done this before, so best defense is good offense, right? And so the offense is, so what's the innovation plan? And there's so many examples in history of firms that didn't innovate And as a result, and they didn't disrupt their own business soon enough, and before they knew it, they were consumed by somebody else. And some of them survived, the ones that we know about. So Kodak's a pretty good example, right? Where they just didn't see digital photography coming. And there's countless other examples. So it's, okay, so how are we going to innovate? Are we really prepared to disrupt our business? And all the other kind of colloquial expressions, better an hour early than a minute late, and blah, blah, blah. So that's the mindset. I would tell you consistently across the board, that is the mindset of the boards. And then it becomes the how. So how do you innovate? And I'm learning this terminology at the lab as a parallel, although different perhaps than what we're doing in the boards. There's Horizon 1, Horizon 2, and Horizon 3. So Horizon 1 is your existing business, protecting and defending that business. That's 90% of the capital that gets invested by companies is that. The other 10%, and I think it's something like 8 and 2 or 7 and 3, is, okay, let's innovate a little bit to help create greater efficiencies in the way that we are working currently in our business. And then it's only 2 or 3% that actually says, let's go and create Horizon 3 new businesses as a result of the innovation that we're doing. And the real estate industry is chronically under-invested. Yeah. And there's research, obviously, pharma and tech and manufacturing even have been doing this for years. Real estate hasn't done it. We've been spoiled. We didn't have to. So necessity is the mother of invention. So that is a consistent theme, for sure, at a board level. And the challenge then becomes, how the hell do you do this? Because organizations and management teams historically, and I was one of them, so I'm not the pot calling the kettle, all that kind of stuff. They haven't done that. They haven't had to do that. They don't know how to do that. And trying to, people like yourself who work within organizations who are quite disruptive and perhaps might have been felt to, would you just go over and do that over there, Joanna?
Exactly.
Now it's, where's Joanna? Get her in here and let's figure out how to do this stuff, and let's make this a board agenda, and let's put some capital, and let's have a KPI against it. And so I would tell you that's happening consistently across the board, on the boards of the larger enterprises that I'm involved, and then obviously on the groups that are a little bit more disruptive of that, they're going, okay, it's our time. Now, how do we capture the moment and the opportunity to do that?
Yes, it's really fascinating because there has to be, and I just read a book called The Art of Insubordination, and I'll get it for you. It's effectively me. It is really fascinating, though, because it's the things we know anyway, but it's the research behind it. And it's how, for example, how Darwin got his theories accepted and rolled out without getting burned at the stake, because he had certain ways that he did things, right? And there's ways of being of the majority and then dissenting. And there's ways of doing that, which we do very well. Entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs do that very well. And you are looking for a moment, because it can feel really like the friction. And then there's a moment, and what's the saying? You make hay, the sun shines. And there's a license to then move. And part of it is because we all have to be willing to accept that not everything is linear. And that's really hard for organizations with the KPIs, with innovation.
But we're built as a species to defend ourselves. And I'm not going to pretend to know all the physiology around that, but we are. And so this change is coming at us as a society, as a generation, like exponentially faster and simultaneous on so many different fronts. So people's initial reaction is, when you're afraid, something you don't, you're like, and you're afraid because you don't understand it. I use the word ignorance. I don't mean it in a critical way. It's just a fact. We don't know. None of us really know. And so we say fear. Now, there are lots of different people who don't react. Immediate quick starts and, okay, what is, and I think more people aren't. I think that's the environment that we're in, right? And getting people to want to then say, okay, maybe I need to, so I think about when I went to London, right? Instead of showing up in London and saying, this is the way we do it at Oxford in Canada. And people would say, that's really nice, Paul, but this is London, so, knock yourself out. I tried to take the approach that said, okay, so let's listen, and let's learn, and let's adapt. And that was Horizon One, traditional bricks and mortar real estate company, albeit most competitive city in the world. And so it was innovation and pioneering a little bit. So if you think of that kind of framework in the context of now what we're talking about, it requires a whole nother level of willingness to do that. And as I said, unless you really truly feel that there's a catalyst there, we don't typically initiate change just for change's sake. So you take all of that stuff, and I actually think the time that we're in is extraordinarily exciting.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's scary as hell.
Yeah. I love that. I think that's exactly right. Thank you for that. Okay, so my other question on it, this was one, because we often talk about, you go to the board to request an investment, or from a management side, there's a lot about how do you structure it, and then you're making requests for approval. So when you're on the board and you're looking at the innovation strategy, and I love what you said about offensive and defensive, and you get requests to invest, right? I come to you, can you invest in this? Can you invest in this? This is the innovation thing. And we run a portfolio, quite technical MCDA model in innovation, but I imagine a lot of people don't. How do you think about the risk of not investing in innovation or tech or future proofing?
I think for a long time it was like, as I said to you earlier, I think it was, if you don't have to do something, then unless you can show me really compelling economics for why you do this, then we'll get back to you, sort of thing. And you can prove anything out with various analyses depending on what variables you use, what assumptions you have, and frankly at how low. It's like buying a piece of real estate. $100 might not work, but at $50, and if it's got lots of challenges, it might actually work better. So I think today, in the context of the innovation requirements, I think there's been sufficient impact on most businesses that they actually have to do something to get back to where they started or not go any further behind. So I think that's my point about necessity. I think it is, so you at least can start the conversation where before you might not have been able to start the conversation. And then the discussions that do go on, and we had one in our board, is, okay, so what's the how do you do this? And I think different groups I've been around have said, we need to do something, so let's just walk before we run, and let's do a little bit, and let's make it small, and maybe let's just learn from it. So let's make an investment in something that might actually generate a return, financial return, but if nothing else, it'll teach us a lot about that. And that's fine, but it depends on how severe the disruption to your business is being felt, and as a result, how committed you really truly want to be to do that. Deciding that and I think all of these things are going to happen outside. So deciding that you're going to make a small LP position in a prop tech fund, not a bad idea, it's just going to have a limited impact. Making a investment in a venture builder for millions of dollars is a much bigger decision, and then making a capital commitment of tens of millions of dollars to actually fund a venture. I think the next level is actually building that capability internally. And pharma companies, tech companies, that's been their business forever. They had to innovate. They're innovation companies. Real estate companies, we haven't really thought that way. Now, that's not being kind, because we have, but relatively speaking. So I think there's a degree of commitment and pace at which you expect the results from whatever decision you've made. And what I haven't experienced yet is the next round, which is, so once you've had something, and that goes really well or just okay or not well, what do you then do? Do you double down? And so I'm really going to be interested to be in the room and start to get the feedback, because there aren't really enough data points yet from in our sector, from whether it's prop tech investing, some of these ventures, they just haven't had enough time to prove out whether or not they can make money or truly be successful and be utilized to protect the business or do the thing that they were originally invested in to do.
That's exactly right.
Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
That was a
No.
convoluted answer, but I don't think we have enough of a time series yet.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and it's fairly young. I think we're starting to see it in the analytics and the data because it's much faster. Except for if we want to prove that data helped in the investment thesis to buy a building, that takes quite a bit longer. The leasing one's faster. The sensor data is quite fast, so we can see that. But you're right, it's an evolution and a maturing of it.
Yeah, and we're show me people.
Yeah, show me.
Like we've always had to do performas for a real estate development, and so we're expecting the same sort of analysis to be done for a innovation investment, and they should be done. You can't just kind of hope is not a good strategy, so you can't just do that. But like even the valuations, right? And I'm a math guy. Look at the valuations of some of these platforms. These platforms are not making money. So it takes me back to kind of .com, right? Where a lot of these companies weren't making money. They were given billions of dollars, and some of them lost billions of dollars, and some of them didn't. What's the valuation? Well, it's $10 million. Why is it $10 million? Show me your revenues, your expenses, show me a NOI line, give me a cap rate, and they can't do that. This venture was valued at this, and we think, so it's a bit, and so I think that has been challenging for CFOs and CEOs and investment people to get their head around, because they're competing for capital internally, and they're held accountable for that type of analysis for a more traditional investment in their core business.
That's right. And then all the structures, the audit structures, the governance structures, the val structures are all built around real estate. So there isn't necessarily the alternative structures, which is probably why OMERS Ventures got built outside.
Got built outside, but it got built by OMERS as opposed to, so there was a difference. So OMERS decided at the top of the house that instead of just giving, because OMERS had the vision and had the ability and support internally to do that, and we had a very visionary CEO at the top at that point in time, and as there have been continually, but this particular individual saw this opportunity, and he said, we're not going to just give this money to somebody. We're not going to do it within our Fortress platforms. We're not just going to give this money to somebody else. We're going to actually create a capability and allocate a small amount of capital to do that. And we're going to learn. Because one of the things that I always hated is when other people made money off the back of our balance sheet. And we didn't, because we weren't aligned properly. So we weren't, even the OMERS Ventures team wasn't capable of building these ventures, but they were capable of assessing ventures and investing OMERS capital and establishing a governance regimen and so on and so forth. And I now think 5 years later, and PropTech wasn't even necessarily part of it at that time, although the lab, as I mentioned, was a relatively early investment. So that's
I love that.
I think about it.
I think that's really good. So if you were talking to leaders of real estate businesses, what are a couple of things that you would invite them to be thinking about right now?
I think the first thing is the real estate that you own, the sectors, the locations, the geographies, the nature, the construction, the occupier profile. Is it fit for purpose for a changing world? So in hindsight, is always easier, right? So we didn't see the consequences of e-commerce and the impact on retail coming until COVID came and accelerated what had been happening for a long time. And then all of a sudden there weren't tenants there, and there were malls that when COVID was less of a concern and people, quote unquote, returned, they didn't come back.
Yeah.
That's not a good strategy. We didn't see the other side of that, which led to last mile and the need for fulfillment, et cetera. And we're spoiled, right? We're in real assets with 5, 10, 20-year income streams with quality credit. And so it wasn't, with the exception of a hotel asset where you had to lease it every day, we didn't have that. And so we didn't. So I think my first challenge is we got to really look at the business that you're in, at the assets that you're in, at the sectoral changes that are going on, and make sure that you got a plan, right? And you've assessed that. And that's not even really innovation. That's just smart business and the reality of running a business. And decide whether continuing to invest in that asset class in that manner, or whether you should just say, you know what, like we're going to completely shift and go and do something else. And I think you're seeing at a sector level, this is more capital allocation and sectoral change than I think it is innovation. You're seeing groups who are morphing. Sometimes, quote unquote, they were so far behind, they're winning the next race. So they were doing old style, call it medical office buildings, and all of a sudden now you rebrand that and call it life sciences.
That's right.
Okay, and I think it's a bit of a spin on something, or it's actually a really smart kind of pivot or evolution, because all of a sudden now life sciences is more important because we've just been through a pandemic. So I think you're seeing that sectoral change. I think the one thing that I have, my brother-in-law works in one of the large food companies in Canada, and he's always said, people got to eat.
Yeah.
I think the one thing that we're finally coming to realize in real estate is people got to live somewhere.
Yes.
And so housing has become something that is affecting everything that we're doing. And so you're seeing, whereas traditionally, and it's the single largest investable real estate asset class in the world, and yet it's the smallest of the big institutional real estate asset classes because it was fragmented in all the history. So I think you're seeing sectorally people going, I want to make sure I'm in the right sector. And then, but what I also think is happening is so that's the what. I think the how is the other part of it that I think every board, every executive team needs to be asking themselves and say, is the way we are doing whatever it is we're doing, is that actually the way we can keep doing it? Because you're getting disrupted left and center by new ways of working. Things that you could never possibly have done before, you can now do easily with a technology solution that doesn't require that you employ investment, development, asset, property, on all the things that go along. And I think you have to be pretty bold in looking at that approach and that way. And I think that then, so if you're a large company, and sometimes large companies don't feel that they have to, or conversely, large companies have the ability to actually go and do that. If you're a small company, I think you have to pivot really quickly. And I don't know how they run an innovation agenda. I think their business is actually an innovation in itself. I don't know if I answered your question or not.
No, you did. And what I love about that is kind of the reframe around the smaller companies being, it is true. It isn't the fortress and then this bit over here. It's the entire business morphs and evolves. So in some ways, it's way easier.
Again, I keep going back to this corny stuff, but necessity is the mother of innovation, right? If you have to do something to survive, you probably are more likely to do it than if it's just a nice to have.
Love that. That's just so great. And thank you so much for taking the time. And I know you're here, you're doing the whole world of the board meetings and everything else in Australia. It really means a lot that you're taking the time. And I know there's a lot of things that people will be able to take and actually use and think through in what they're doing. So it makes a massive difference. So thank you.
Great. Real pleasure. Enjoyed our chat.